Hi folks, welcome back to Recently Seen Reading. I'm Heather, and I thought I would film a short, I hope, video summing up 2019 in reading for me and a little bit about what I hope to read in 2020. It's a beautiful sunny day here. We're waiting for a snowstorm to roll in tomorrow and keep us pretty much housebound, so good time to do some recording. So I keep track of my reading like a lot of folks here on YouTube do, using Sophia at Portal in the Pages spreadsheet. It's a marvelous thing to work with if you like working with Excel and you're comfortable with maneuvering data in a spreadsheet. And I am. It's a big part of what I do in my professional life. So I've used her spreadsheet with some minor adaptations for a couple of years, and I've found it has some upsides and some, for me personally, some downsides. One of the things that I would count as a downside for me is that it makes me hyper competitive with myself about how much I read each year or each month. And I read a lot, I always have. In the last 2 or 3 years, my reading has ticked upwards pretty dramatically. Part of that, I think, is from watching a lot of BookTube and by just investing most of my free time in reading, since I get a huge amount of pleasure from it. So in 2018, I read just over 260 books, and in 2019, I read just over 250. So that means on average, I read between 4 and 5 books a week. And in 2020, I'm actually hoping to reduce that number a little bit. Partly because I think in some cases I'm reading a little too quickly, and in other cases because I'm reading things that don't give me a whole lot of pleasure or a whole lot of complicated pleasure. So that's my goal for 2020, is to read slightly under 250. Even a lot less than 250 would be fabulous. I'm going to try to detach myself from my competition with myself about how much I read each year. I don't think it's really useful or skillful for me. And I know it makes lots of other people kind of antsy. How much did I read? How much did that other person read? I just think it triggers a lot of comparison, and I don't know that helps us in our reading lives. So that's one of the things that I hope for 2020, is that I will read fewer books. The other upside of tracking my reading year over year in a spreadsheet, and by looking at it and comparing it year over year, is it helps me get some insight into what was really pleasurable for me in my reading and that was not as pleasurable as I hoped for. Because there are only 2 reasons for me to read. Either I'm reading something because it's useful for a project I'm working on or some day-to-day routine thing, or it's pleasurable in some way. So I want to make sure that I try to read things that bring me the most pleasure, whether it's just the simple pleasure of a light entertainment of a mystery or a romance, or whether it's more complex pleasures from some of the history I've been reading. So that's one of my primary goal next year, is to read more things that bring me more pleasure and more complicated pleasures. One of the things that I noticed in comparing my reading year over year is that the light fiction that I've been reading for entertainment, when the mind can't handle anything else, hasn't been as satisfying as it used to be. In 2019, I had a look at my 2018 reading and decided I would branch out a little bit in my light reading and my genre fiction reading to see what would happen, to see if I could add new types of books into my reading list. So I read a little bit more fantasy than I usually read, and a little bit more science fiction than I would usually read, and a lot more romance than I would usually read. And I read a lot of romance as a very young woman and enjoyed some of the return to it this year, but not as much as I had hoped to. So I don't think there'll be as much romance reading for me in 2020. And I think also there's probably going to be less mystery reading, or at least less contemporary mystery reading. I think I'll probably give Dorothy Sayers a reread. It's been a long time since I read her work. But that's one of the things that looking at my reading year over year using a spreadsheet can help me discern, is that there was something that felt off in my reading, and some of it's the light reading, and some of it turns out to be that there's been a slight shift in how much of the front list I'm reading, how much of very current contemporary works I'm reading as compared to previous years. And I've been reading a lot more contemporary, recent publications. Not always to the good, I think, for my reading pleasure. And the other thing that's happened is that in 2019, had a significant jump, something like 12%, in the number of books that I was reading by US authors. And that means that my other reading was a little unsettled. The things that give me a different kind of reading pleasure were gone from my reading last year. So I'm going to adjust that in the coming year, in 2020, and aim to read a little bit more broadly and to reduce the number of American writers I'm reading. So that means that I'll probably end up reading more Canadian writers, more British writers, more international writers. And when I look at my list of most enjoyable reads of the year, 5 of those top books are by Canadian writers. So that's a signal to me that I'm adjusting my reading a little bit away from the front list and a little bit away from US authors is probably going to yield some interesting reading for me in the year coming up. Since I've noticed that one of the things that seems to be skewed in my reading in 2019 is the dominance of the front list, I think what I'll try in 2020 is to skew it in the other direction, to read more of the backlist, and in some cases the backlist. I'm going to try to read more 18th century literature. In my previous incarnation as an academic, working in literary studies, I focused primarily on the 18th century and the early 19th century. So one of the things I want to do for myself this year is to reread some of the books that were important to me in that part of my life. I don't know how many I'll get through, so I've set myself very modest goals of maybe 6, and some of them will be chunkers, but we'll see whether I get to them. The other strategy I'm going to use to shift my reading a little bit is to read books that were either published before 2000 or that I read in years before 2000, things that made an impression or that I remember vaguely or that I'm curious about whether I would still enjoy them or curious about how my reactions to them would have shifted. I'm going to avoid reading things that I suspect are not going to have aged well and that will just lead to irritation. But there are a handful of things that I am curious about and want to reread. I'm also going to continue reading stuff published between 1900 and 1950. I've been enjoying that part of my reading life over the last 3 or 4 months. And the third thing I'm going to try to kind of adjust my reading this year is to read more poetry. I tried reading more poetry in 2019 because in reviewing my 2018 reading stats, I noticed that I was reading very little. And I thought I should try to adjust that a little bit and read quite a bit more poetry than I have for years. And I've enjoyed reading it. So I'm going to pick up more. I think what it's going to give me, or what I hope it will give me, is more careful reading of the text. Because poetry you should read more slowly than you gulp down other things. And I want to relearn how to read more slowly. This ties back into my goal to actually read fewer books in 2020 than I read in 2019 or 2018. So I think that's how I'm going to adjust things for the new year. In terms of what I thought my best reading experiences in 2019 were, I have 8 books that I'll mention. In terms of books that I reread, the 2 best books I would say would be James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is beautifully written and complex family structures, struck me the most in my reread of that this year. And the second reread that's at the top of my happy-making pile of books for 2019 was Sylvia Townsend Warner's The Corner That Held Them, which I've spoken about recently. It's an unusual historical novel that talks about convent life in 13th and 14th century England. In terms of best book from an author that was familiar to me that I've read before, it would be Lynn Cody's Watching You Without Me. I found this a supremely creepy book to read. It's about the relationship between a sister who's come home to take care of her developmentally delayed sister following the mother's death, and their relationship with a male caretaker who gets involved in the family. And it's a very creepy to read book. Very well done. In terms of writers who are new to me, who are actually some of the best reading I did this year, are all 3 Canadian novelists. Megan Gale Cole's Small Game Hunting at the Local Coward Gun Club. It's one of my best books I've read in the last couple of years. Very difficult to read, lots of difficult subject matter because it deals with sexual trauma, essentially. It's set in Newfoundland on a very stormy day, complex manipulation of point of view and narrative voice, but well worth the read. The other was a total surprise to me, something by Mary Swan, who I hadn't read before at all, The Boys in the Trees. And this was a prize-winning novel. It's about the devastation in a family at the death of a father in unexpected ways. And I was surprised by that because I'd never read any of her work. And I was surprised by the complexity and control in the narrative point of views. You can hear a theme in the kind of books I read. I like books with complex narrative points of view. And the third in new to me authors is another Canadian, Joan Thomas's Five Wives, which tells the story of 5 missionary families in Ecuador and the difficulties that emerge in following the deaths of the 5 men in this cluster of families. And it surprised me because of, again, narrative control, unexpected approaches, a light hand and touching on religious themes, very compelling narrative, yet also very domestic. I'm not sure whether it'll stand up, say, to be in the top 10 or 20 books over a decade for me, but it's one of those books that made me want to read more of Joan Thomas's work, since I've read none before. And lastly, in the category of nonfiction books that were at the top of my list, there are 2. One would be Tressie McMillan Cottom's Thick, which you'll probably have seen all over BookTube, and it's a fabulous collection of essays, a thoughtful, intellectually sound, great combination of personal and academic narrative, actually quite easy to read and easy to understand, which is an incredible accomplishment from an academic. Highly recommend that one. And the other one, which is actually going to be available, I think, in the UK and the US this year in 2020, is Alicia Elliott's Mind Spread Out on the Ground. And this is a memoir. Elliott is a Haudenosaunee woman. Elliott's A Mind Spread Out on the Ground covers a huge range of territory in the same way that Macmillan Cottom's book covers a huge range of territory. Elliott's focus is more clearly on the personal and the political in a Canadian sense. Lots of excellent essays about what it means to be an Indigenous woman in Canada, what it means to be poor in Canada, what it means to struggle with mental health questions. It's an excellent collection of essays, and I'd strongly recommend it to anyone who's looking for a nonfiction read in the new year. I think that's it for me today. I've been enjoying watching your 2019 summaries and your 2020 reading goals, and I hope you have a fabulous week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.